Good. Not yet, but we're getting there.
Yes, that's why they should move it.
Really?
And that's
Wow.
why.
Oh, you did?
Okay, we're ready to go. Again, good evening. We expect a very beautiful week this week. I just looked at the weather, and Thursday is supposed to hit 72 degrees. Wow. Hopefully winter is over. Okay. Today we have the privilege of hearing the amazing story of our friend and neighbor, Ann Landis. Ann was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to a military family. Her father was a career Navy pilot. The family was always on the move. By the age of 17, Ann had lived in the United States, England, Morocco, and Japan. Ann graduated from Mary Washington College of the University of Virginia and holds a master's degree in counseling psychology. She met her future husband, Jim, in Iceland, and she and her husband pursued an expatriate life for 35 years, living, working, and raising a family in 13 countries. Ann is here today to explain what an expatriate experience is all about. Now let's hear all about Jim and Ann's amazing life story in 13 countries around the globe. Ann, please tell us more.
Thank you, Lee. Good afternoon. I'm Ann Landis, and my husband Jim and I live in a cottage in Spruce Court. We moved into TidePointe 3 years ago from Sea Pines, where we had a condo in the marina in Harbor Town. Next. This picture was taken from our balcony in Harbor Town. It's a nice view. When Lee Lopez asked me to give a TidePointe talk, I was quite reluctant. I kept telling him that I didn't know what I could talk about that would be interesting enough for people to come and listen to. He thought our experience as expats, expatriates if you will, could generate some stories of interest. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to just stand here and give a travelogue of all the countries we lived in. I thought that would be boring. I brushed him off, but he was persistent. Unrelenting, he was, I must say, unrelenting. Then I remembered an incident that occurred not long after we moved in. It was just a comment made with little thought and of no importance, but it left me stunned and dismayed, and it continues to live in my head to this day. One evening, Jim and I were sitting in the rotunda waiting for our dinner companions, and I noticed a lady standing off to the side with a group of people. I smiled, and she came over and introduced herself, and I told her my name. She asked me what I did. I paused for a moment, and she said, "What did you do?" Well, I replied, "We were expats. I was an expat wife." "Oh," she said, "you were just a housewife." Well, to say the least, I was taken by surprise by her remark. She walked away back to her group of friends, and I sat there feeling devalued, dismissed, person of no interest at all. It was the word just that I couldn't get out of my head. I couldn't shake it off. My husband noticed the look on my face and asked me what was wrong. I told him what had just happened, and he said, oh, it's nonsense. It was just a throwaway line. Don't pay it any comment. Don't pay it any attention. But it bothered me, and it continues to bother me to this day. So this brings me to my talk tonight. I thought I'd tell you what the expat experience was all about. Next. Okay, that's self-explanatory. Expats is a term much used, but little understood, I believe. An expat is someone who lives outside his native country, often for work or higher education or cultural immersion, a certain lifestyle, or even for retirement with a lower cost of living. It involves legal and visa processes, work permits, complex tax planning, and can even involve paying taxes in both countries. Expats differ from immigrants. Immigrants relocate permanently to a new country with the idea of remaining there and maybe even becoming a citizen of the country. And an exile is somebody who's forced to locate elsewhere. We were corporate expats. Next. My father was a Navy pilot, so I spent my early life moving from place to place. As Lee just said, by the time I was 17, I had lived in the US, Morocco, England, and Japan. When I graduated from college, I went to Iceland to visit my parents, who were living there at the time. There was a welcome party the night I arrived, and Jim, a young Navy ensign at the time, was invited to the party. I met him on June the 9th, 1965, 60 years ago. That evening changed the course of my life. Weeks after meeting him, he was transferred to Naples, Italy, and invited me to visit him there. And I did. He asked me to marry him, and I did. 6 months after we met. I moved into his bachelor apartment that had been part of a 14th century monastery, plastered onto a cliffside overhanging the Bay of Naples. Next. There couldn't have been a better way to start a life of adventure. Kate, can you show them our apartment? It's the white building up there to their right. That's the apartment we lived in. That's the Bay of Naples. There's a boat dock underneath us and in the bay. The bottom picture is of Mount Vesuvius in the moonlight. We ate to that every night. I'm sitting on our balcony. It was very romantic. Next. That's just a painting I did of our view from the balcony. After the Navy, Jim went to graduate school in Arizona, a school known in those days simply by its initials AIFT, the American Institute for Foreign Trade. It was also referred to as Thunderbird because it was situated in the desert on an old Air Force base known as Thunderbird. That was the name of the Air Force base. The school had several name changes, and now it's known as the Thunderbird School of Global Management and is part of Arizona State University. The 2026 International Trade Rankings recognize Thunderbird as #1 in the world in international trade. It's come a long way since those days. And it's the only school in the US to be ranked in the global top 10. The program was designed to train men and women to work for companies overseas, concentrating in Latin America, but they also offered courses geared to Asia and Europe as well. Its focus was business, language, and area studies. They offered an abbreviated program for wives or spouses, and I was enrolled in that program. I didn't have to take the business classes. Most students graduated from there with job offers galore, and more importantly, with a job. After some consideration, Jim chose to go with the much sought after, more initials, FNCB, First National City Bank, now known worldwide simply as Citibank. The deciding factor for us was the speed in which he would be assigned overseas. FNCB was known in those days as getting interns into a new country as fast as possible. We were sent to Puerto Rico within 10 months. Okay, I know every one of you here has traveled, at least moved once in your life. So I'm not going to discuss all the ins and outs of moving, but I'm going to discuss what it was like to move as an expat. It would begin with Jim calling from the office, "We're moving!" And then after the excitement of learning the where and the when of our next assignment, my head would just go into overdrive. So much to do. Next. This is some of the paperwork associated with moving into Haiti. Not all of it, but some of it. Jim would take care of the paperwork involving Citibank. Setting the date, arranging for the move, applying for work visas, papers, transportation, police reports, health exams, sometimes inoculations. Cars had to be sold, boats had to be sold, homes had to be found for the pets and the houseplants, and you had to arrange for language lessons also. Among my first questions were, do we get a look-see? Can we take the pets? And is there an American school? A look-see is just exactly what it sounds like. A trip to the next destination to have a look and see what it's all about. Can we take the pets? We did sometimes, but it was difficult, involving special papers and even visas for the pets. And sometimes quarantine was required. And air travel was really hard on the animals, especially in the summer months. So most times we had to find homes for our beloved pets, and that was pretty heartbreaking. Next question, is there an American school? This was important because we wanted to keep our children in the same system so that they'd have a continuity and a familiarity with textbooks and lesson plans and all of that. Our kids were remarkably flexible and adaptive. They understood that Daddy has a job, this is his job, this is what we do. They didn't complain, they didn't get pouty or withdrawn, as I understood some kids would, especially teenagers, leaving friends behind. We were lucky in this respect. Our kids seemed to enjoy the adventure of it all. Most places offered a French school, a British school, and an American school. Much later came international schools. And they were very popular with the expats. Our children didn't benefit from an international school. Next. In addition to the American school, another way to keep the children in touch with their home country, in touch with their roots, was to send them off to summer camp in the States, where they could interact with non-expat kids. For several years, our kids went to sailing schools in North Carolina, under the watchful eyes of doting grandparents, whom unfortunately they only ever got to see once a year. Next. Okay, this is a picture of our children in Mexico City in the 9th grade. While mentioning schools, I have to tell you that we had to send both of our children back to the States for schooling when they reached the 9th grade. We were in the process of moving to Mexico City and found out there was no room at the American school for them. We didn't want to have to switch them into another system so late in the game. We always assumed they'd go to an American university, and we wanted them to be prepared to take their SATs. The summer of the move, we scrambled to interview 10 boarding schools up and down the eastern seaboard. They were accepted by the schools of their choice, and Jim and I proceeded on to Mexico. We were all trying to find our way through this difficult situation. I must say, our children seemed to handle it very well. But we, the parents, struggled with the so-called empty nest.
She said 9th grade.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go.
Yeah.
I've lost my way.
Page 5 in the middle.
Thank you, dear. I have my helper here today, my daughter. She's reading along with me. I'm not a public speaker, so I need my notes. Okay. Jim and I worked really hard to get over the empty nest syndrome. He had his work to take his mind off of everything, but I found myself ungrounded. What was I going to do with the next stage of my life? What was it going to be? What was it going to turn out to be? I ended up enrolling in the International University of Mexico, which was accredited with the Western Association of Colleges and Universities in California. 2 years later, I received my master's degree in counseling psychology, and within weeks, I found myself packing up the house and moving on to the next assignment. Another major consideration for expats is the quality of health care. As a whole, expats are pretty healthy. They're hardy. They have to be by necessity. But sometimes the health of their children enters into the equation, and posts may have to be denied because of lack of appropriate care for their children. We fortunately didn't have to do this. However, while living in Haiti, our daughter came down with typhoid fever. She and I had to return to the States for a couple of months so she could get better in a cooler climate. In Venezuela, I developed a case of dengue fever, otherwise known as breakbone fever. Because of the pain involved in this, it's a mosquito-borne viral disease with no known treatment. Because of the pain, I spent my nights soaking in a cool bathtub for weeks trying to ease my aching joints. Okay, cute, huh? I'll explain. While living in Panama, Jim developed a condition that I bet no one here has ever heard of and no one's ever had. During the annual physical, the doctor discovered a spot on his lung. We immediately returned to the U.S. for further consultation, and they ruled out finally that it was cancer. But what was it? Well, they determined that it was from breathing in bat guano, dried bat guano. If you can imagine such a thing. Our house was atop a small hill in the center of Panama City, and the pool was surrounded by tall, dense trees, and in those trees, hanging upside down, were vampire bats, which only came out at night to drink from the pool. We also had ordinary run-of-the-mill bats, lived in the eaves, and they would come out at 5 o'clock every afternoon and fly and swoop and dive around for about an hour and then go back into their crawl space in the rafters. We called them the 5 o'clock bats because it was cocktail hour, and we'd sit there watching them while we had our drinks. In our day, the American Embassy issued post reports detailing the security numbers attributed to each country. They went from 1 to 4, with 4 being the most dangerous. The reports also gave insights into customs and cultural matters in the countries. These were really interesting. Basically, it was a primer on proper behavior in every country, the State Department was. And it was sort of like a what not to do. For example, in the Muslim world, you were cautioned not to eat with your left hand because it was considered unclean. I'm left-handed. That was a problem. Also, it wasn't acceptable to show the bottoms of your feet or your shoes. I don't know why, but that's very difficult when sitting on a floor in a tent. We did a lot of that in Howdy, sitting on the floor in a tent. In England, you were thought of as rude if you asked a gentleman what he did for a living. In Iceland, it was advisable not to have a well-stocked bar visible to the locals. Well, this was a very informative post report they had. Much of our overseas living occurred before the internet entered our lives. It wasn't until we moved to Brazil that cell phones were starting to become commonplace. We had moved into and out of 11 different countries before I got my first cell phone. In one country, Venezuela, we lived for 2 years with no telephone at all. The kids got in the van that took them to school at 6:30 every morning and didn't arrive home until 5 o'clock at night. I had no way to know where they were. I couldn't communicate with them. I couldn't communicate with my husband or the school. I had no phone. If they failed to show up on time, I was at sea. This was probably the most anxiety-ridden time for me in my expat life, not knowing where the kids are. Next, okay. Identity cards, health certificates, driver's licenses, all of these were part of our daily lives. You had to keep some of these actually with you. You always had to have an identity card with you wherever you went. Lots of paperwork. Google was not a thing. Gathering information was time-consuming. Communications were unreliable. Dependable mail service was often non-existent, and substantial documentation was required for every move. Now, you throw in the Italian concept of domani, which means tomorrow. You ask, when is something going to get done? The answer is domani, domani, always tomorrow. Well, sometimes tomorrow never came. Arriving in a new place always involved hotel living while house hunting. It wasn't unusual to live in a hotel for as long as 2 months. The most important task was getting the kids enrolled and settled in school and arranging for the school bus to come to the hotel. Next came finding your new home, including which neighborhood best suited your needs. Jim never wanted to live in what he thought of as Gringo Gulch. He said he didn't move overseas to live surrounded by Americans. He wanted the experience of local culture, and he didn't want to engage in backyard cookouts and beer pong. Sorry, dear. We always seemed to live a bit away from the expat enclaves. The city helped mightily with the house hunting. Even though the introduction of cell phones made this task easier later in life, it still took considerable time. In one country, I looked at 60 houses before I found the right one. As you worked your way up the corporate ladder, your housing allowance increased, and city was very generous. The bank was home-based in New York, so our allowance was based on the cost of living in New York City. Our housing allowance was the same that we would have to pay if we lived there. Any money charged for rent above their cost of living for us, we had to pay out of our own pocket. But they were very generous, and most expats lived very well. In addition to arranging for schools and housing, you also needed to get integrated very quickly into the society. There were organizations geared to this. Newcomers clubs were indispensable for information, as were American women's clubs, university clubs, and something called the American Society. You needed to find reputable doctors, pediatricians, dentists, orthodontists, haircutters, dry cleaners. You had to learn the names of food items, fruits and vegetables in order to shop. In some countries, you had to haggle over the price of anything you bought. You had to learn how to haggle. Oh my God, that was hard. You had to learn how to write checks in a language you didn't yet speak, in a currency you were unfamiliar with. The kids needed sports and scouting activities and gymnastics and ballet and maybe music and piano lessons. You needed a car or two. You needed new driver's licenses, which involved testing in a language you had yet to master. Sometimes you had to learn to drive on the other side of the road. Or you had to drive at a place where you couldn't read the signs. They were printed in an alphabet you couldn't even decipher. In Saudi Arabia, all the signs were in Arabic. All of them. There wasn't a single sign that wasn't in Arabic. It was really something. Language lessons were provided as a matter of course by citizens. Sometimes in the country to which you were locating with native speakers, and sometimes to an entirely different country. We moved to French-speaking Haiti and were sent to Spanish-speaking Puerto Rico for 3 weeks of total immersion in French. This meant arranging childcare for the kids in a hotel while Jim and I were in class all day. Once situated in Haiti, I quickly realized I had to learn Creole to speak to the staff. Haiti was a fascinating country, though. Oh, it really was fascinating. Back in the days of Napoleon, it was one of the richest colonies in the world due to the production of coffee and sugar for Europe. But after the revolution that ended in 1804, which made Haiti the world's first black republic, the plantation-based economy collapsed, and it just went downhill, spiraled downhill forever. We lived there in the early 70s, when it was the second poorest country in the world. It was the time of the dictators Papa Doc and Baby Doc, and the infamous paramilitary Tonton Macoute. Everybody's heard of the Tontons, I'm sure. It was a place of magic spells, zombies, and voodoo. One would fall asleep at night to the sounds of the voodoo drums echoing in the hills. I served on the school board at the American school, along with a man named Max Beauvoir, who was a biochemist, he was a Haitian diplomat, and he was a voodoo priest. Very, very popular man. Dealing with doctors in a language not yet mastered could prove exasperating, to say the least. You want to be sure you're understood by your doctor, and you want to be sure that you understand what your doctor is saying to you. Not long after arriving in Brazil, I needed an eye doctor. The first doctor spoke German and Portuguese, but he referred me to another doctor who spoke Portuguese and Japanese. It was a lesson in frustration, I'll have to say. Doctors were always hard. There were two questions that people would often ask expats. The first one was usually, did you have help? And the second one, did you feel safe? Help referred to maids, cooks, nannies, drivers, gardeners, everything like that. This usually depended on where you were living. In Latin America and Asia, and sometimes in the Middle East, it was commonplace. In Europe, not so much. The poorer, the less developed the country, the more it was considered a necessity. People needed jobs, homes needed to be occupied for full-time security reasons. Often bills were delivered to the house for signatures. Drinkable water was delivered to the house, as were such items as chickens and eggs and fresh produce. There were daily deliveries, sometimes entire grocery orders, and someone needed to be in the house to receive them at all times. Babysitters, as we know them in the States, were not available anywhere. And in Brazil, I had a driver there that actually served as another level of security. A woman driving alone in Sao Paulo, Brazil, could be robbed stopping at a traffic light. You had to have somebody to protect you in the car. It was amazing. Cooks were appreciated for their expertise with the unfamiliar ingredients and the exotic ingredients. The amount of help deemed necessary increased as seniority in the company increased. As you started out in a third world country, young and eager, you would usually begin with a part-time daily maid, and then you progress and you get full-time help, and then came a live-in, and then a couple, and finally you ended up with staff. As the homes got bigger and the grounds got better and bigger, you could find yourself in charge of an entire group of people. The live-in staff came problems with everything. I can't think of a problem it didn't have. The problems multiplied with live-in staff. Squabbles, jealousy, quarrels, they ruled the day. And they weren't even your children. In some of the poorer countries, the help looks to you as the patron, the parent, the counselor, even as your banker. Loans are needed. Their children need school uniforms or books. They need to pay for an unexpected doctor's visit or for medications. Or sometimes they'll even say they were robbed on their way home and need an advance of their salary. Some expats became so attached to a particular nanny or housekeeper that they would arrange to have them move in and relocate with them to another country, which was always a problem. Paperwork involved, visas, it was incredibly difficult. And then once they got to the next country, you were responsible totally for them. It was a nightmare. We never did that. Most often we just had cheery goodbyes and moved on and started all over again. It was something. I'm not sure what. For the most part, we lived behind, did I skip a little line there? I have to pause on the question of did you feel safe? Thank you, dear. The answer was yes, but we were careful and we took precautions to be safe. For the most part, we lived behind walls and fences and chains and padlocks. We had decorative ironwork known as rejas on the doors and windows. You see this in Miami a lot. Or we lived in high-rise buildings with eagle-eyed porteros or a concierge, and we kept a very low profile, trying not to call attention to ourselves. When out walking, you dressed very simply, you didn't wear any fancy jewelry, you didn't wear expensive watches, you didn't want to attract attention. Silver jewelry was safe, as were beads and costume jewelry, as long as it didn't look like the real thing. You didn't want a potential thief to get close enough to you to see if it was real or not. Fine jewelry was often left in the bank and only brought out for special occasions. As a woman out walking alone, I never carried a purse, and I would never stand in front of a bank on a city street waiting for a ride. Too many banks were robbed. We were always careful of what was said around the help and on the phone. This may sound complicated, but it became second nature after a while. Despite the precautions, we were robbed from time to time. We were victims of purse snatchers and pickpockets. Our car was broken into, the pool furniture was stolen. And thieves came into our home and walked among us and stole from us in 3 different occasions in 3 different countries. In Venezuela, they stole all of my jewelry. In Haiti, they took necessities of life, pots and pans, towels, cooking oil, and coffee. The children actually saw the thief on 2 different occasions. One of those times was early Christmas morning, and he was stealing the Christmas presents from under the tree. Most of my jewelry was stolen twice. But we were never accosted, never attacked, and never had to make decisions about defending ourselves, except for once. One night in Buenos Aires, Jim left work about 7 p.m. and hailed a taxi. Very shortly, the driver pulled over and let two men get into the cab, one on either side of him. They poked something hard into his side and said they had a gun. He didn't see it, but he accepted as fact that they did. They drove him around for a while, and then they took him to the outskirts of the city and parked in an open field. They wanted the PIN number to access his bank accounts. He complied, of course, and they proceeded by cell phone to an accomplice to try to empty his bank accounts. They managed to access two to their limit, but that was about all they got. They held him for hours and managed to finally give up, and they told him to get out of the car. He actually thought they might shoot him at this point, but they drove away, leaving him in the dark, and he had to find his way out of a part of town he had no idea of. He walked until he found a cab and got home late at night to a very annoyed wife, complaining that he didn't call home to say he'd be late for dinner. I'm so embarrassed. Next. Okay. This is a picture of our apartment building in Mexico City. We lived on the 7th floor, which is probably that one right at the top. You can see it's all glass windows there. I'll tell you something about the glass in a minute, I think. Yeah, this is our apartment building. On the morning of September 19th, 1985, at 7:18 in the morning, Jim and I were ready for the day to start. He was eating his breakfast at a table in the bedroom, and I was propped up in bed reading the Mexico City news. We were listening to the morning news from San Antonio, Texas on the television. But something felt amiss. We looked at each other and we paused. The curtains started to sway back and forth gently, and I could hear popping sounds. We leapt up and ran for a door frame. That's what they said to do in the case of an earthquake. Stand in a door frame. We had heard that that's what one was supposed to do, but we started to notice that the big fern in the corner was starting to tremble and sway back and forth. So we quickly ran for the back door. I could even hear the glasses rattling and shaking, the dishes in the cupboards. It was really frightening. Then I heard a roar. I don't know where it came from. I never bothered to find out, but there was a loud roar, and we raced down 7 stories to the street. Nobody came out of our building. No Mexicans came. We were the only ones standing in the street, Jim in his business suit, me in my nightgown. I hadn't even put a robe on. Oh my goodness gracious. I started to feel foolish dressed like that, standing in the middle of the street on a weekday morning. And when the shaking stopped, we went back into the building. What could we do? I'm in my nightgown. And we called the elevator, and we could hear the elevator coming down the shaft, bumping from side to side to side. So we abandoned that idea and went up the stairwell, which is a no-no in a high-rise building. It's the weakest part of a high-rise, stairs. But we had to do it. Little did we know that the sirens that were starting up then, we would hear for days and days to come. The TV was off and the phone didn't work. This was long before cell phones and the internet. We noticed ripples in the walls held together by the wallpaper so it didn't fall. The shower ball had fallen, and of course the elevator was unusable. But we noticed that our windows weren't cracked at all. Those are solid sheets. Those are sheets of glass held together just by silicone putty. It wraps around the building all the way to the bedroom, and they weren't broken, so it must be fine. Couldn't be too bad. But the sirens were going off, for sure. Well, we had a key to our downstairs neighbor's apartment, who were away on home leave in New Jersey. So we decided to go down to see what their damage was, in case we heard from them and they would want to know what had happened. We got there, and there were huge cracks from ceiling to floor all down the hallway in their dark blue walls, with the white plaster showing through, looking like scars all down the walls. And that's when I got scared. It's like, is this building safe? What's going on here? This is really terrible damage. They were on the 6th floor, we were on the 7th. That's right. And the building twisted like this, because you could see the ripples in the wallpaper. And, well, anyway, that's when I got scared, because they said we were going to have an aftershock, and I didn't know what that was going to be all about. Well, the anticipated main aftershock hit the next evening when we were having a much-needed drink. All of a sudden, the TV came on for the first time since the earthquake. We'd forgotten to turn it off. and the evening news from San Antonio said that all of Mexico City was waiting for the major aftershock. At that very moment it struck with a magnitude of 7.5. We laid on the floor, protected by furniture, in an embrace, and I had to ask Jim to stop patting me on the back for comfort so I would know when the shaking stopped. After that, the days were filled with the most horrible stories of destruction and death. The quake had registered a magnitude of 8.1 on the Richter scale. It had lasted for 5 minutes, and it was said that if the shaking had gone on for 1 minute more, Mexico City, a sprawling city of more than 18 million people, situated on the soft clay of an ancient lake bed, would have been completely destroyed. The American embassy said that 35,000 people died that day. But the official report from the Mexican government, in a futile attempt to protect the tourism industry, said no more than 10,000 deaths. Ha. That number would have been even much higher if it had occurred 1 hour later in the day. At 7 a.m., the schools were unoccupied, thus sparing the children. Some of the worst damage was done to government-built buildings, presumably due to graft and corruption in the industry. Tent cities sprung up all over the city. Thank you, dear. And they were there for years. We went back to Mexico City years later, and the tent cities were still there. Thank you. How did I get there? A friend of mine who lived in the heart of the city left his small apartment building to get some pastries from the bakery across the street. As he watched, he saw his home being reduced to nothing at all. The floors just telescoped down, floor upon floor upon floor upon floor, straight down, until there was nothing but a layer of rubble left from where he'd just exited. An expat family we knew dragged their dining room table outside and slept under it at night, feeling safer there than in a high-rise building. People hung weighted plumb lines in every room to signal the slightest movement. I would wake up at night with my heart racing, only to see that the curtains were swaying again from yet another aftershock. Thereafter at night I kept my purse, containing money, credit cards, and contact information, hanging on the back door handle, so I could grab it on my way out in case of an emergency. Thankfully, that occasion never arose. However, years later, I would find myself doing exactly the same thing when we moved to a war zone. It was days before our family knew whether we were alive. The airport was closed and communications were down. Our neighbors on home leave in New Jersey had heard a ham radio message that all Citibank International staff in Mexico City were accounted for and safe. They had my parents' phone number, and so they called them, and they said my dad was crying on the phone when he heard their news. He quickly called the children's schools to notify them that we were safe. Our kids didn't know what had happened to us, but they knew there'd been an earthquake, and they knew how close we lived to the heart of the earthquake. And they called Jim's parents. Jim's parents had contacted the American Red Cross to find out about us, but they never heard back from them. They never got any information from the Red Cross. A year ago to the day, we left Mexico City for our next assignment. That night we had our first full night's sleep in a year. But I have to tell you, Jim and I are so sensitized to the slightest movement that if we feel anything, we just jump up and prepare to flee out of the room. And this has happened more times than you can even imagine. There are little mini earthquakes very often in this world, and we've been subject to many of them.
Even here.
Even here, that's right. I one time saw my fan pulley circling. There was an earthquake. Okay. This is our beloved Paris. A little collage I made. Kate, if you can point out to them our apartment building and the bottom. Well, okay. The center one is my living room window, looking out across our avenue. The bottom one is a view of the apartment building from the park. Oh, and we've got all kinds of things. The upper one is my daughter standing in our living room with the bas-relief and the mirrors and everything. It was a beautiful place to live. We had a wonderful time there. ago, we moved to Paris. It was 1986, and France was celebrating its bicentennial year. We were fortunate enough to live on the left bank in an iconic 19th century Haussmann building with bas-relief ceilings, as you can see there, 7 marble fireplaces, and 1 lone water closet. If anybody knows what a water closet is, it's a room with a toilet. Each apartment had a wine cellar in the basement and a chambre bonne, a maid's room, on the top floor, which had a single toilet and sink in the hallway for all the occupants of the hall, all of the maids that lived up there, to use. This served as a sleeping space for the overflow of college kids that came that summer. We put them all upstairs in the maid's room. But they could shower downstairs in our place. They didn't have to shower in the hallway. Am I in the right spot, Kate? I'm on 14?
Page 13.
Thank you. I'm so glad I have you here tonight to help me through this. We could walk to the Musée d'Orsay and the Rodin Museum. From our living room window, we could see the gold dome of Les Invalides, which is where Napoleon's remains are housed. And if I turned my head just right, I could see the tip of the Eiffel Tower. What a momentous time to be in Paris. The city was alive with celebration, and everyone we knew wanted to come visit. Family, of course, and friends of family wanted to come, and friends wanted to come, and family of friends wanted to come. Oh my goodness, everybody wanted to be a part of the party. Now, I know the French have long had a reputation for being unwelcoming, not being friendly, let's say. Some go as far as to claim they're anti-American. I never ever felt that was true. When people speak of the French in such a way, they most often are thinking of Parisians. They think the citizens of Paris are cynical, sardonic, going through life thinking they're better than anyone else. Well, hello. It's my point of view that Americans also are rather proud of themselves. Proud to be an American, as the song goes. As we project this going through life, we display this, we get along, we dare say, we're smug about ourselves. So I understand now how the French feel about themselves. Proud people of a proud nation, just as Americans are. However, I have to say this, it was said by the expat community that the Parisians seemed disdainful of everybody not from Paris itself, disdainful even of their fellow Frenchmen if they weren't from Paris. Well, perhaps a little bit. So not anti-American so much as anti-everyone not Parisian. Even if that were true, I found the last time we were in Paris, a shopkeeper said to me in English, "Have a good day." Mon Dieu, what is happening to the French? After 4 glorious years in Paris, it was time to move on. Next assignment, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Next, got it. Okay. It was the summer of 1990, and Jim started working in Riyadh while I stayed behind in Paris. I should mention, before I go any further, some of these pictures. These are what the typical houses look like. That's the doorway where she just was. And if she goes over down there, that's a picture. If you can see a little dot in the sky, that is a stealth bomber flying over this ancient sand house in Saudi Arabia. It was such an odd moment to stand there and see. The stealth bombers had not been seen yet. This was the Gulf War, and they brought them out, took them to Saudi Arabia for the Gulf War to try them out. Nobody had seen this plane before, and I just looked up in the sky and saw it. I wish it had been a better picture, but at least I captured it. The house above that, our Saudi guide who's there in his white robe, he was born in the kitchen of that building. The door down on the ground, that one, they kept slaves there until the 1950s when Saudi Arabia did away with slavery. That's what a picnic looks like in the desert. My daughter's footprints in a sand dune. This is what Saudi looked like. Exactly like that. How far did I get in this? Let me see where I left off to describe that. Well, it was hard to pack up to move into Saudi. There were certain things we couldn't take, things that were forbidden to bring into the kingdom. So I had to go through everything we had and sort through it. We were allowed no more than 100 books, including 1 Bible per household, registered with the government. The book's allowance was tricky. No art books depicting churches or the human form. Well, that just about eliminates all art books. No cookbooks with recipes, including pork or alcohol, were allowed, so no cookbooks. No photos or albums with pictures of people in suggestive clothing. No religious statues or representations. No artwork or paintings depicting the human form, including portraits. You couldn't take a portrait of your mother. Certain food items were not allowed, of course. Well, the list was endless. I won't go over the whole list. It was just endless. When your household goods arrived, they were taken to a warehouse for weeks and thoroughly searched. Any offending items were confiscated or destroyed and put back in your shipment. A friend had the photo of her young children, in their bathing suits at the beach, and they took the pictures and tore them up and dribbled the pieces back into her album. That was shocking. Another friend had a needlepoint pillow, which her mother had worked, and they cut across the stitching of the needlepoint pillow, looking for drugs, instead of turning it over and cutting on the fabric side. I knew an Indian woman who was jailed for carrying in poppy seeds for her cake baking. Your mail was opened and read, magazines had articles that were censored and cut out, newspapers appeared with magic marker blacking out offending photos. Even the clues to crossword puzzles were censored. That August, I flew to Saudi for what was called a look-see, to see where we were going to be living. The compound was nice. It consisted of a city block surrounded by a high, thick stone wall. It contained 5 houses, one each for the executive staff of Saudi American Bank, which Citibank was known as in the kingdom. It had a pool, a tennis court, and extremely lush gardens for a place in the desert. The morning I was to fly back to Paris, Jim and I were sitting up in bed, just like in Mexico City, sharing the morning newspaper, and there was a heading across it that said, "Disregard any information about events that occurred on the border." Okay, well, we quickly forgot about that. We didn't know what it was about. I arrived back in Paris and was greeted by my daughter, and she said, "Saddam Hussein just crossed the border between Iraq and Kuwait. There's going to be a war." Oh. Well, what to do? The family said, "Well, you can't move into a war zone, no way." The insurance company said, "You can't move into a war zone, we won't insure you." Citibank said, "Of course you're moving." Well, you guessed it, we moved. The build-up to the war was an interesting time. American women soldiers were driving jeeps through the streets of Riyadh. Fuel-laden planes flew directly overhead, so heavy and low that we thought they would crash into our compound. The American embassy was looking for families to give Thanksgiving dinner to all the soldiers stationed in the desert. General Schwarzkopf, remember General Schwarzkopf? Heavily surrounded by security, he gave a speech to the expat community telling us we were perfectly safe. Gas masks were issued, everybody built safe rooms in their homes, and kept packed bags by the door in case an emergency arose. We were to listen for the absence of birds chirping or the sound of cars crashing in the streets as an indication of the presence of nerve gas. We were then told to go upstairs, stand in a shower, and put a blanket over our head to protect us from the gas. Amazing. Okay. Well, yeah, the local newspaper, the North Carolina newspaper, interviewed me when I went to stay with my parents for the war. It was a short war, and it was over by spring. I had been on the first flight out, and I was on the first flight back in. Okay. For me, people who left during the war slowly started returning, and life got back to normal. Whatever one thought of as normal in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. For me, normal included making homemade wine and a vile concoction called jetted gin. Here's a picture of my recipe book for these liquids. I'm surprised I could still find it. Normal included trips to a forbidden video store, clandestine meetings of more than 5 women playing bridge or mahjong, furtive home visits from beauticians. Oh, it went on and on. All beauty shops had been closed before the war, and there were no movie theaters there either. Normal was talking in code on the phone, because calls could be monitored. And I tell you, trying to dispose of an empty bottle of illicit whiskey was a prodigious affair. It was just something to ruin your mind. You got a whiskey bottle and you're not allowed to have it, and how do you dispose of it? It went on all the time. Anyway, looking back, I realized that so many things were cloaked in secrecy. In the Mutawa, the religious police were ever present. I'm surprised that I wasn't stoned in Chop Chop Square making illicit whiskey. Okay, this is Carnival in Brazil. Okay. I see I'm almost running out of time. I'm going to have to cut this short, but let me just say we loved Brazil. I'm going to stop there because I was told I could speak for 45 minutes and I've already gone over, so we'll have to skip Argentina. I'm sorry about that because it was a wonderful place to live. But I've got a little bit to say right here. Could you, there, thank you, dear. As the year 2000 approached, we decided it was time to start looking forward. What lay ahead? Retirement from the hectic life was certainly in our future. Aging parents were a concern. Our married children were living in the States. A desire to settle down and enjoy a slower-paced life was calling to us. In the back of our minds, we had always thought we would call South Carolina home. Jim's from Greenwood, South Carolina, upstate, in a town called 96. But we knew the kids probably wouldn't think that was an ideal vacation home every year to come see their parents. So we decided we needed something other than 96. So, are we in the right place? Yep. We already had a timeshare on the island, which the whole family had enjoyed. There we go. So we moved to Harbortown. We bought a slip in the marina and a 28-foot Catalina named Solitude. Jim did love that boat. There's our condo. You saw our condo, and this is just, you've all seen this. This is Harbortown. I'm having trouble in the light, I'm sorry. Our globe-trotting days have become a thing of the past. Due to various medical concerns, sorry, the light, let me do this. But now we can live vicariously through our children. Both of our kids inherited our wanderlust. This is a picture of our son James. He's with the Czech president, Peter Pavel. James retired after a career with the State Department, encompassing domestic and overseas assignments in Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. He then went on to become head of corporate security for Radio Free Europe, home-based in Prague in the Czech Republic. He now commutes between Prague and Alicante, Spain, where the families bought a house and are indeed living the lives of true expatriates. They plan to remain there until their school-aged children are finished with their secondary education. Our daughter Kate, who's here tonight helping me, wears two hats. She's the director of giving for hospice in Savannah, where her job focuses on fundraising, but she's also the owner of a yoga studio. Now, as a proud mother, I have to brag a little bit about that. Her studio, called Savannah Power Yoga, or SPY SPY, has for 12 consecutive years won Best Yoga Studio in Savannah from Savannah Magazine. Very proud of that. A popular feature of SPY is the tours that she offers. She has led yoga retreats to such places as France, Costa Rica, Morocco, and Bali. This year, she's taking a group of her students to Machu Picchu and Cusco, Peru. Yoga at 11,000 feet, not for the faint of heart. Now, I realize that the lady who thought of me as just a housewife did me a great service. It caused me to reflect long and deeply on the life I chose, the life we chose, all those years ago, and given the opportunity, I would choose the very same life all over again. I'm going to end by showing you two pictures. Jim and I had been married a few months when this was taken. We were young, we were in our 20s, on our way home from a party one night in Naples. We stopped at a photo booth. Remember photo booths?
Yeah.
Well, as you can see, we were having fun acting silly for the camera. Next. And this was taken 60 years after that picture, this past Christmas Eve, by our daughter in Savannah. I call it, after all these years, still having fun.
Wow.
Thank you.